Welcome, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to this fourth event in the alumni series, and particularly thanks to joining us wherever you are this morning and at whatever time. We know we've got a small percentage of people from Australia, about 3% of those who signed up today, so on the same time zone as our speaker, quite late in the evening, with a large number from Asia, and then about a third from Europe, as well as people around the world. We're really delighted to be here in this growing series of alumni events, and a way of staying in touch when we're otherwise in so many ways isolated through COVID and lockdown. So I'd like to introduce myself, the seminar, and our main speaker today, Tony Wheeler. I'm a professor of infectious disease epidemiology at the University of Warwick, and I'm here today mainly because I'm also taking on a role as one of the directors of the Institute for Global Pandemic Planning, a new centre we're looking to set up to see how we can better advise governments in their responses to future pandemics and major similar events. It's also really poignant that I'm talking to Tony Wheeler about travel this morning, because going through my own life, travel has certainly been transformative. After medical school and a few years working as a hospital doctor, I headed off on my belated gap year and got as far as England and learned some tropical medicine, France, and lived for a short while in a commune, but then went and lived and worked with Médecins Sans Frontières in Zaire, as it was then, Democratic Republic of Congo now. I think having gone out as a person who was a hospital doctor thinking of a career in intensive care, I went there and turned into a public health doctor focused on infectious diseases. So it was that travel experience that's led me to my current post now in infectious disease epidemiology and an interest in pandemic planning. So Tony Wheeler clearly also had transformative travel in his past, having taken his gap year at a more appropriate time straight after university. He headed off and travelled across Asia, leading him to write the book Across Asia on the Cheap, and then that building into founding Lonely Planet Publications with his wife, who co-wrote the books with him in 1973, a company he developed and kept going until 2011 when he sold it on. And I think many of us have no doubt had copies of one or indeed several Lonely Planet guides. I know I certainly did in our lives that really added to our own travel. That pioneering aspect of Tony could also go back to his time at Warwick. While doing engineering at Warwick would seem a very sensible choice for any aspiring engineering student now, Tony was a foundational student at Warwick, the very first intake way back in 1965. So again, was taking something of a pioneering choice in choosing Warwick in that founding year at the time. So, and has clearly obviously gone on to actually follow his own path and be quite innovative. Although he sold on the Lonely Planet Guide in 2011, he continues to work actively to write and to work through his foundation, Planet Wheeler, supporting a range of different aspects related to travel, but also the arts and science and research. So if we can just move into the discussion then and welcome Tony onto the screen. Hi, welcome Tony.
Thank you.
Can I start straight off by giving you some questions? And I suppose it's questions about the 2020 that you've had. All of us around this webinar have perhaps had very different 2020s to the one that we'd imagined. If it's possible to ask you some aspects of what it has brought to you and also what you would have been doing had we not had COVID-19.
You know, it's been an extraordinarily strange year, because I started off pretty much as I thought the year was going to go on. I did a trip with friends in Australia, and then I was in Japan. And I was in Japan, remarkably, at a university conference, Wakayama University, talking about overtourism. And while we were actually there, the whole overtourism problem was completely solved. We went from overtourism to undertourism as we actually sat around discussing this. I was in Japan when the cruise ship that was one of the first real pandemic crises pulled into Yokohama. So I was there as people were discussing, are they handling this well? And I think the answer was no, they were not. And then, I then went back to Australia briefly. I went to London briefly. I went to Socotra, the island off the south of Yemen. It's been described as the Galapagos of the Indian Ocean. And it's technically part of Yemen, although it's a part of Yemen where there's not a war going on. And I was actually there when suddenly everything started to shut down, and I had to evacuate very quickly and get on a flight back to Egypt. And then I flew back to Australia thinking I was going to be back in London in a few weeks' time. And none of that has happened. I've been in Australia ever since. We've been locked down in Australia. We're not allowed to leave the country, basically, unless you can pull a lot of strings, which I can't do. So I've had a year of not traveling, which for me is very strange indeed. But it has been a year of observing what's going on. I've been an absolute addict for looking at the figures every day. I turn on to worldometers, coronavirus things, and to various other ones, Johns Hopkins, their figures out of the US. And it's fascinating to see. But if anyone asks me, and I'm sure we will get around to this, saying, what's your predictions of what's going to happen? The answer is, I have no idea at all. Because everything I've thought that was going to happen all this year has just not happened. It's gone off in totally different tangents.
Right. Thank you. Just as with your point of what people want to ask you is just to flag to everybody that we've got some content we planned to talk about, but then a lot of alumni sent us in questions with the invite. So we've reformed a bit of what we're planning to talk about based on the questions you sent us, and we'll very much continue to do that. So as we're going through this discussion, there is a question and answer function, and if you put questions into that, and people can like them and vote them up, we'll keep a track on that, and we'll steer our conversation toward that, and at the end very much directly come and look at those questions and answers. But in the questions we received before today that came in online, a lot of people did ask you to do just that, Tony, and look into the future. So although you say you can't, that's as if this year and next year are really, really hard. If we're looking down 5 years down the line, a lot of the questions we had came from a worldview that things that will never be the same, they'll be utterly different. But I was really interested to see several, actually from people who said, might it be that this is just a blip? And we saw Alex from History in 2019 talked about a demand that might bounce back stronger than ever for travel particularly, or a pent up demand that Chris from Mechanical Engineering mentioned. And Stefan, an executive MBA student, had put together this longer term view of, we've had this huge and continuous expansion of travel over decades. We've now got the Chinese market really just opening up in terms of them getting the capacity to travel. Might it be that in 5 years' time, we look back and, oh, we're back to business as usual after a blip, albeit a huge one? Or do you think absolutely not? Things will be different forever in that longer term?
We look at, the obvious thing to do is say what happened on previous cases. After SARS, things bounced back. After 9/11 and the terrorism scare, things bounced back. And the general consensus has been that things do tend to bounce back. We tend to go back to where things were before. But I really don't think this is going to be the situation this time. I think we're going to come back. People will be traveling again. And I think, in the last 24, 48 hours in the UK, discussions about rolling out the first vaccinations, these all hold hope that things will get back, but they're not going to get back to normal. I've been intrigued in all sorts of things that have been happening. I had lunch today with a tourism guy here in Australia, and we were talking about what things already we were seeing that were working and were not working. Well, one thing at the top end, there's been a real increase in charters of private jets, and people who've got lots of money and can afford to isolate themselves from the outside world have been doing it very successfully. Or at the other extreme, my friend I was having lunch with was saying that he really thought that the first thing to bounce back would be backpackers, that they'll be getting out there, that they're I'd say brave or foolhardy, but they're less likely, he felt, to be stressed by the concerns, and they would get out there. They really wanted to travel, and they would be back traveling again. Here in Australia, he was saying that you cannot, for love or money, get a caravan, because caravans, there it is. You take your own little home around with you. You're isolated from the outside world. You're not concerned about what will happen in a hotel because you're like a turtle carrying the world around on your back. So those two extremes, caravans and private jets, we felt were both doing okay. But in the middle, who knows? I wouldn't want to be running there right now.
Right. So you're really picking out that idea of there may be, it sounds, not just bouncing back, but indeed some opportunities, that it's a great time to be manufacturing caravans, so long as you can get the parts, presumably, to do that. And again,
well, that was
sorry.
That almost from the start, that we're going to see local travel being popular, and travel where you do, a caravan's a good example of it, but road trips, we're going to be more likely to involve ourselves in road trips than in intercontinental travel. And I think that's, of all the sorts of air travel that have been hit, it's been intercontinental air travel that has been most badly hit. The fact that every airline has retired all their 747s, and there's not maybe Emirates might have the odd A380 flying somewhere, but a lot of them are parked out in the desert. And I think it's going to be quite a while before intercontinental travel gets back, even if the Ryanairs and the EasyJets and the Wizz Airs are operating more successfully. Yeah. So I think it's really going to be ups and downs. And, there will be opportunities for people who can see the little windows opening. And equally, there's going to be people who are feeling the pain in the travel world in a very large manner.
Yeah. And I suppose we're talking about bounce back then as though it's something we want. But as you just mentioned before this, Katie, you were in Japan at a conference on Overtourism. And I know with some of our questions that came in, talking about things like Thailand looking at reforming the sort of travel that they want to have as a country, perhaps, and indeed some other countries. So quite a lot of the questions coming in were concerned, well, do we want to go back to how we were before? Or has this opened ways in which we might actually more intentionally take control of the travel and how that might happen? Have you thoughts on how we might?
Yeah, look, I've got lots of thoughts on that. One of the big questions on this whole pandemic has been the cruise ship business, because cruise ships were one of the first focuses. When we first saw things going wrong, they were going wrong on cruise ships. And the whole cruise ship business has really, it's shut down, and the couple of attempts there have been to restart in a small way have not been very successful. And I think, if cruise ships come back, they're going to come back in an entirely different fashion. Two of the things that I've seen on this, one is, one of the biggest cruise ship operations is the cruise ships that go out of Miami and scoot around the Caribbean and go back to Miami and put very little money into the islands in the Caribbean. And quite a few of those islands have said, look, we appreciated them in some way, but if the cruise ships are going to come back, we want to have much more control over them. We want to have more local involvement. We don't want all the business just to stick on the cruise ships. If they're going to come into our islands, into our ports, they have to be putting money into our local economy. And I think that's an example of how things may be different. The countries, the places, we look in Europe, that the cities that were really complaining about over-tourism, I'll name three immediately: Barcelona, Amsterdam, Venice. And, all three of those have gone very rapidly from over-tourism to under-tourism. And I think they've seen, how pleasant it is to wander around your city without being elbowing your way through all the tourists. And I think there will be questions of, do we want to go back to the way it was before? We've had a spell when it wasn't that way. And if we do go if tourism does restart, we want it to restart in a different fashion. So I think there will be lots of things where we may be restarting tourism, but it won't be the same tourism that we had in 2019, 2021, or whenever it gets to working again. Will be that 2020 interruption will be a step between what it was in one year and what it is in the next.
Right. Okay. And I think you picked out a lot of examples there where you describe people with their very local experience, whether it be an island or a European city, of really wanting to change at their local level their relationship with tourism and the big drivers of the tourist industry, like cruise ships. We've quite a few questions through coming in, thinking on the sort of more global aspects of travel, and obviously particularly climate change and the possible contribution to climate change from long distance air travel, cruise ships, but indeed many other aspects of the travel industry, and quite a lot of questions of how this might be changed. And that spanned from people thinking about long distance air travel, as you say, which has a very high impact, perhaps being crashing dramatically now. Do we want to try to regulate that? To others who said perhaps the only justification for air travel are these long distance cross ocean trips, and it should be all the short hop air travel that's actually more replaceable while still maintaining. So have you thoughts on that, how we can have ideas about travel and the climate that might have been unthinkable this time last year?
Yeah, absolutely. Because I mean, it was unthinkable. If you said to anybody in the airline business or international tourism, that all that flying, and you used to have to look at flight radar and just see all those aircraft crisscrossing the skies, and you had to say this had to have a big effect. And yet people would say, well, we just can't change it. It's so many things that it's so important, whether it's the aircraft manufacturers or all the people working for the airlines or all the destinations that they fly to, that there's no way we can step back from this. And then suddenly we discovered we could step back, we could just totally shut it down in no time at all. So I think there are going to be lots of questions about reopening it. But if I'm going to defend air travel, it may be say it's very visible. You look at all the aircraft flying overhead, you look at all the aircraft on Flight Radar 24, which I used to do a lot, and I have not done much recently. Or you go to any airport and you see them all there, and you think, well, this has to have a huge impact, and it does. But actually, of the whole thing in the world, it's only a small part. It's only I'm not going to try and quote what the percentage is, but it's not 95%. It's more like 5% than 95%. So I think it's easy to cast air travel as being the great disaster, and if we can sort out air travel, all the other problems of climate change will be solved. Well, they won't. There's far more things than just air travel that affect climate change. But on the other hand, this has been a good thing that a lot of people who tried to deny climate change are suddenly saying, oh yeah, we saw what happened in China when suddenly everything shut down and the skies cleared. Suddenly you could see across Tiananmen Square. Generally it was just a haze, and suddenly there was clear visibility. It's gone back to being bad again. But briefly, you could see that these changes could take place.
Right. And I think, as you flagged, we've really just observed this unnatural experiment, perhaps rather than a natural experiment, has shown us just how much change can happen, and that our sense of a steady, progressive world isn't actually true. There will be major changes, whether they be of our own doing or not. I think something that's been really striking to me is perhaps a lack of global governance, and I think not particularly of travel in this, but in the whole pandemic response, where even the vaccines that we're celebrating now are very much a marketized vaccine production response to a very obvious place in the market for a vaccine. One of the questions we'd in from Peter, who studied philosophy back in 1975 at Warwick, was asking us from the Institute for Global Pandemic Planning, how can we establish international convergence of post-COVID policy? And I suppose, oh gosh, that's absolutely what we're about, and we need compelling arguments to do it with, and we need compelling ways of interacting, engaging with the political infrastructure to do that. But what's been really striking to me is how little global governance there has been through the pandemic. And I suppose when we're thinking to this future and we're thinking of what we might do and what we can do and how we can change, have you a sense of how global governance can act in the travel industry?
I wish I had, because one of the things about this entire pandemic is there has been no convergence at all. You know, whether you've got Sweden saying, we have the answer, and then lots of people saying, no, you don't, or in Britain where, you know, 1 week this country is on the okay list, and the next day it's, you know, you've got to be back by 4 a.m. Here in Australia, you know, we thought we were one country, and suddenly we discover that every single state has a different view on it. You know, the most extreme example has been Western Australia. And, you know, there were always jokes about Western Australia. Perth is closer to Singapore than it is to Sydney. And the West Australians would quite happily go off and be their own separate country and have nothing to do with the rest of Australia. Well, for the last 9 months, they have. They've shut the borders down. Nobody can come in and out of Western Australia. It's like you know, it's not just a separate nation. It's, you know, we've divided up our nation into lots of separate little nations. And I think this has been true all over the world, that Europe has shut the doors to the US. The US has gone on crazily a lot, as if, you know, every state could make its own plans and life would go on as normal. I had an American friend who said, we've become the drug dealer downstairs from Canada. You know, the Canadians don't want anything to do with the Americans. It's been remarkable how the world has just splintered. And some places have done very well, but you have to ask, at some point, you have to open up to the world. And just because you've managed to make things work in your own country, you know, I think of New Zealand in that situation. I think of Taiwan. You know, Taiwan has been one of the poster boys or poster children for how to manage the pandemic. But at some point, they have to open up to the outside world. And what happens then? Do they open the doors and then suddenly, boom, the pandemic comes to them and they've managed to steer clear of it for so many months? There is no global answer. Every country seems to, or even in Australia, every state seems to think they have their own answer. And I don't think there is one.
Yeah. And that again, we're in a way both echoing that this lack of global convergence, or even far from convergence, even reasonable between country collaboration on this. For the most part, it has been country or even areas within country. Quite a few of the questions we had coming in, whether it be climate change or whether it be defending travel in the future, have that sense of, again, I've got one here, Iqbal from Management for Business Excellence, is taking into consideration the amount of damage and how we prepare the global community remains in the preparation of tackling risks such as the pandemic. What global leadership can come into play to actually let us do this better in future? Have you a sense of mechanisms of global leadership and how that can play out? And I suppose in any domain.
I'm not sure if we've seen any real global leadership, but we've certainly seen places where we think, well, look, they did it, they handled it properly or luckily or correctly or, you know, in a sensible fashion. You know, we look at America and think, oh God, what a disaster. Although let's face it, you know, the European figures a few weeks ago, they've gotten much better, but made America look good for a short spell. We look for New Zealand, you know, Jacinda Ardern is the poster prime minister for an awful lot of places. And, you know, you've got to hand it to the New Zealanders. They have jumped on it. And of course, there are a number of nations in the Pacific that really have not had any coronavirus at all. I've been corresponding with a friend of mine who lives on Tonga and is involved in tourism there. And Tonga has not had a single case. Nobody's popped up with it. Nobody's come in with it. They are totally clear. On the other hand, they are totally cut off from the outside world. And, you know, anybody who's involved in tourism there, their tourist business has totally died. And they're talking about, it'll be June next year before we get flights in. It's a long time to be cut off from the outside world. So I don't know that there are any answers. And we look at the places that have done well and think, well, you've done well in this respect, but the fact that you've cut yourself off from the world isn't a long-term solution. I think the problem in Europe, obviously, is that no country has really cut itself off. There've been, that you've got to come back and you've got to self-isolate and you've got to come back and quarantine. But even the quarantine and isolation question, some countries, they say, come back home and behave yourself. And others say, come back home and we put you in prison, essentially, which that's been a little bit the situation in Australia. When I came back to Australia in March, I had to isolate. I had to go into 14 days of isolation, but I could manage it myself. 2 weeks later, you were sort of more or less arrested and put in a hotel. And then these hotels became the focus for coronavirus escaping into the community. So, it was, the government might have thought it was a good idea, but it turned out it was a very bad idea. And I've been in contact with a friend of mine in Hong Kong who I said to him last week, well, how's it been for you? And he said, it's been fine. I've been overseas 3 times in the year. I've been traveling. I've done a walking trip in England. I've been around Greek islands. I've done this. I've done that. He said, the only problem is the 3 times I've come back to Hong Kong, each time I've had to isolate for 14 days. So I've had 42 days this year locked down in my apartment. He said, and that's been fine. But they're now saying that next time I do it, I'm going to be locked up in a hotel. And that for him wasn't so fine. So I don't know, I'd like to say there are answers, but I don't see any answers.
Right. You picked up there, as you say, some of the areas in the Pacific that have done particularly well on the one hand in terms of controlling the infection, but have been particularly heavily hit economically on the other, because a major part of their income in terms of the tourist industry was wiped out, which is very much with a similar flag from Astrid, a distance learning MBA graduate around Pacific islands such as Fiji, or Hong Kong, another MBA graduate about New Zealand. And then Tracy, a former French studies student, talking about regional airports and sort of more rural regions perhaps losing their capacity through this. So those more isolated areas that have been particularly heavily hit. Have you ideas about how you think that is acting now and how it will play out as we come out of this, whether some of that may be a long-term thing?
Yeah, I agree. In the region I look at and I think, well, this is a real example of the problems is Africa, because effectively, half the cases in Africa have been in South Africa, and even South Africa has managed to go up to a peak and then bring it down to more reasonable levels. But Africa as a whole has really, it's been nowhere near as bad as Europe or America or South America in particular. Africa has really escaped the virus effects really well. But economically, it's been disastrous. There's been so many places. I look at Kenya, where tourism is very important. I know if we look, I've always said, if you want to have an example of the value of tourism, you look at African game parks. What is an elephant? An elephant is a large gray creature that tears up your farmland or eats your vegetable crops or breaks into your garden and eats all the lettuces or whatever. It's not a creature you particularly are friendly with, unless it's something that brings tourists in and you're making money from tourists. So effectively, tourists are a protective element for the wildlife in Africa. Well, there are no tourists. And I've heard lots of stories about this has not been good for wildlife, that poaching has increased, that a lot of animals that were always threatened. There's not enough space for them anymore, but they're being threatened a lot more at the moment when there isn't the protective element of having tourists around. So I think Africa is a good example of a place that, it's escaped the virus effects to quite a large extent, but it's not escaped the economic effects.
Yeah. And I think as you're bringing there that there's the economic effects on a lack of tourism in terms of things like safari and travel, but you also mentioned then it having an impact on conservation in those countries because there isn't a prioritization to protect elephants. You in general have quite a wide view of the benefits of travel for the destination beyond just the money that travelers coming bring things. And have you thought of how
Oh,
this
look, I
pandemic
definitely have, because I'm a great enthusiast for gap years. I think, the people who go off on their gap years, much younger than me, they probably learn more in that gap year than they did in the last 3 years of school or the next year at university. It's amazing educational project. But the thing about travel is it does put people together. We're not just somebody on a television screen or some sort of media contact. Suddenly you're meeting people in real life. And I really think it'd be a great regret for me if the coronavirus, the pandemic, the effects of it does cut back on young people traveling. And there's been talk of, it's going to be, when travel restarts, it's going to be something for the wealthy, people who can isolate themselves, those people in the private jets or whatever. They're going to feel safer up at the business class end of the aircraft than stuffed back in economy. And I think that would be a really bad thing if travel does become for one group of people and not for another, because I think it does have an awful lot of good things about it, which I would hate to see disappear.
And that fear you have for the sort of independent, perhaps less well-off traveller, again, is very much echoed in a couple of the questions we've had in. We've had questions in relation to, are there ways we can, in a constructive way, aim to protect the backpacker? I think Julie, who did English way back in 1982, had the sense, can we protect our young people's capacity to backpack? And Sixian from linguistics more recently, again, that capacity to support spontaneous ad hoc travel. Have you a feeling of how we can act to protect that, or do you think it is just wait and see how it goes?
I think it's wait and see how it goes to some extent, but there's lots of other things that, I know here in Australia that a lot of backpackers who come out here on their gap year and kick around Australia for a while also do work in, a lot of it's farm, picking fruit and things. And suddenly those captive tourists who came here and worked for low wages and picked fruit are not there picking the fruit, and farmers are complaining about this. And I was the person I had lunch with today discussing some of these problems was saying how backpackers who go to these areas and they may not be paid well, but they're paid enough, and they become a part of the local economy, and very often put more money into the local economy than the average older Australian tourist with their caravan spends. We'd rather have the backpackers picking the fruit and earning the money and then spending it in the pubs and the activities and doing things than the older tourists coming through in the caravans and not spending any money at all because they're looking after themselves. So I think, that we forget the economic value of backpackers as well. This is true in a lot of places. I know there have been lots of examples around Europe of suddenly the Romanians can't come in to pick the vegetables and so on. What's going to happen? Because the Germans aren't going to do it, or the Brits aren't going to do it. We needed the Romanians and the Bulgarians coming in, and suddenly they're not coming. Well, what are we going to do?
Yeah. And you see, there's all of these impacts we've felt and the limitations. Some of the other questions we had were people who, again, the optimists amongst us, who were saying, okay, after this, things are going to be very different and there are going to be new opportunities opening up. And people are actually asking, what sort of new opportunities do we see as we open up? And the examples people have come in, somebody in the hotel industry, I talked about rural tourism, and I think you mentioned too that people might be doing more road trips and traveling perhaps in more rural areas rather than just to the main destinations. Have you a sense of that extension of tourism perhaps into more remote areas? And people mentioned who wants to be in a crowd at the Trevi Fountain post-pandemic but people might be much more happy out in the countryside. Do you see a shift there? And
I do, yeah. I think that may well be one thing that really does go well. You know, I've done a fair amount of walking in Europe over the years. In Britain, I've done the Wainwright's Way across the country, and the Pennine Way up the centre, and the luxury Cotswold Way, and I've walked in France and Italy and other places. And I think that walking may be a good example of something that does come back strongly, because it's rural. If you're off walking, you're by yourself for extended periods. You're not at the Trevi Fountain or the Spanish Steps crowded in with everybody else. So I think that walking, and I've contacts I've had with European friends, I've had invitations. As soon as you can come back to Europe, come and join us on the Camino Santiago in Spain, or come and join us. And there's a new walk between Ravenna in Italy on the Adriatic coast and Florence, Firenze, the Dante Way. Come and spend a week with us doing the Dante Way. And maybe this will be something that does come back in a stronger fashion, that people want to get away from the city crowds. They want to get out in the country. And as a result, walking, which has always been popular. But it's remarkable. I've been involved in a number of discussions and things. And one of the groups that I've been talking with has been in New Zealand, where they've been looking at, how will tourism rebound in New Zealand after the pandemic. And they were going through their own little over-tourism concerns. And a lot of tourism in New Zealand is nature and the walking, the country, the tramping, as walking is called in New Zealand. And there were concerns that these tramping tracks that were such a part of New Zealand culture were just getting overpopulated with all those foreign visitors. We want their foreign money, but we don't want them crowding off our walking tracks. And suddenly they're not. They haven't been there for the last 6 months. But they're saying, okay, when tourism rebounds in New Zealand, how do we keep better control of it this time? And walking tracks are an example that I've done some walking in New Zealand as well and enjoyed it very much. But I hadn't realized that one of the walks I haven't done there, and I've been thinking about doing it for years, has really had a lot of criticism for being overcrowded. That it's a very good walk, so it's attract lots of walkers, and people in New Zealand have been saying, no, we'd like to keep the numbers down, restricted. Right. Who knows?
Okay. Thanks. While I was listening to you, I was also keep scanning an eye through some of the questions that have been coming in while we've been speaking. And I think one that I thought was really interesting was we've been picking out the different parts of the industry and how will this part do or how will that part do. But the question that's come into us from HH was, can the travel industry be sustainable as tourist only, or does the likely permanent nosedive of business travel mean it is no longer viable as cost effective for low and mid-income travelers? And that's that idea that the travel industry is a whole and that in some ways some parts might subsidize another. Have you?
Yeah, I mean, we've been talking mainly about sort of tourist travel, but business travel is, and there is a lot of people who cater to business travelers and, getting them up on the sharp end of the aircraft in the business class seats are concerned that the whole Zoom thing, we will be doing our business meetings on Zoom in the future rather than, the counter argument has been that meeting face to face is important. And now that will come back for that. But, one of the things I think we're going to be seeing is people have realized that they don't need to go into the office so much. They can work from home more. They don't need to be going places to have meetings. They can do it from Zoom and other types of group meetings online. And although, a lot of things may come back, they're not going to come back to the same extent. And there's been discussions about, do we need to live in cities to such an extent? Will this push people out to live in the country? That there'll be, the housing values are going to go up in the villages and the Cotswolds or wherever in England, is really nice to live. And the housing values are going to go down in London because you don't need to be living in London. And we have not seen the answer to this yet. Here in Australia, one of the things it's been remarkable how property values have not sunk. And a lot of the discussion on that has been, it's been a lot of Australians who thought, oh, I'm not going to put up with whatever's happening in America or Europe. I'm coming home to Australia and now I need to buy a house. You know, I mean, one of there's so many crazy elements to this. Again, here I'm looking at the Australian situation, but car sales are booming. And why are people, suddenly money's shorter and you'd think that, you'd be economizing more, and yet the sales of Mercedes are going up. And part of the argument is discussion on this has been, well, I can't go on holiday this year, so instead I'll buy a new Mercedes. So who knows, who would have thought that? Who would have thought that cutting out travel would push travel down and push Mercedes up? My God, who can understand these things?
Yeah, certainly people who are talking to us about the climate change aspects will have that sense of this balance. As long as we're spending our money, it has inevitably seems to have ways of actually doing it in ways with negative environmental impacts. So one question too that came, you mentioned right at the start, before this pandemic, you were at a conference in Japan for Overtourism. The question we've had voted right up to the top of our thing, which was actually asking you, what were your ideas then? Can you tell us what was your recommendation about reducing overtourism in Japan, and how we can again respond in the future?
It was an interesting that this is a university in Japan, a little bit south of Kyoto and Osaka, called Wakayama, and they've got a tourism department at this university. It's not a very big university, but its tourism department is very strong. And they had been studying overtourism, and they've been looking at it in all sorts of different respects. They were looking at the Venice and cruise ship situation. They were looking at places in Spain where, the local shops had disappeared because the shops were all being given over to things that catered for tourists. And so, the overtourism question can generate itself in all sorts of different respects. The fact that, that you can't get an apartment, but you can get an Airbnb stay. These sort of overtourism things, they show themselves in different manners. And this overtourism conference was trying to look at all these things. And then actually, while we were there, almost in front of our eyes, suddenly the visitor numbers had dropped, and we were I could have got on the train and been in Kyoto in 2 hours or something. And people were saying, now is the time to go to Kyoto. Kyoto, which is, if you're looking for a Barcelona, Amsterdam, Venice in Japan, Kyoto would be the first place you'd look at. And people were saying, now is the time to go to Kyoto. The crowds have disappeared. It's suddenly empty. I've been to Kyoto a number of times, and I didn't have time to rush back there, but maybe it was the time to do that.
Yeah. And again, on this thought of the overtourism, we've had some questions saying about where there might be successes and how there might be success. One here from Sarah Jemison is, if you have any knowledge of countries such as Bhutan that seem to have adopted policies on sustainable development, would you be able to share examples of successful models? And that's what there's another question that came in around Costa Rica using the tourism to protect their natural environment, with echoing what you described, how that income in Africa. Have you examples of countries where you think they really have been getting it right, or are now getting it right in managing tourism?
I'm not sure if you mentioned Bhutan then, but Bhutan is often pinpointed as a place that has managed their tourism, but they've managed it by turning it into a high cost place. I've only been to Bhutan once, and you don't, in some respects, you don't get a lot for your money. You pay a lot, but and it is a center for Aman resorts. There's a number of these very expensive, luxurious resorts in Bhutan. And I would not like to see a country become totally dependent upon the Aman resorts of the world. They're very nice, they're very luxurious, they're very beautifully designed and everything else. But I don't want to see tourism become something that is totally restricted to that. And I think that the Bhutan solution of just make the costs high and we'll just, we'll live off the luxury end of tourism, is not a totally fair answer. That there are, I don't know what the answer to this is. That it's very easy to say we just make it more expensive, and that keeps the numbers down, but the same amount of money comes in because we, instead of having 100 people at $10, we have 10 people at $1,000. It's not a good answer, I don't think. We need both. But I don't think that, nor do we want to say that, okay, you can come to Venice because you've passed the examination of understanding Venetian history and appreciating the art and culture of Venice. I've spent some time in Venice over the years, and I've always said that Venice is the perfect place for looking at the 2 streets over tourism, except in Venice, it's 2 canals over. Because you go into St. Mark's Square, and it's totally overrun with tourists. They're all crowded in there shoulder to shoulder. But you don't have to go very far away from St. Mark's Square. And suddenly you're finding yourself in some church that you feel is neglected. You're thinking, why am I in this church all by myself, looking at this wonderful medieval art? And it's magnificent. And where are the tourists? I'm in Venice. Surely I should be crowded in here shoulder to shoulder. Yeah, if I was over in St. Mark's Square, I would be. The town in the last year or two, I've been to in Italy that just blew me away for its beauty and its way lack of tourism was Ravenna. I mentioned earlier this walk in Ravenna, a beautiful city. And it's but close to Bologna, close to Rimini. It's on the Adriatic coast. Beautiful churches, wonderful mosaics, and I didn't feel it was overrun by tourists at all. I really felt, why am I not suffering more tourists here? I'm appreciating this wonderful church, and yet I'm not having to fight my way in to look at it. So I don't think, there may be lots of places in the world that do suffer from over-tourism, but there are lots of places that manage tourism very well and could even have a few more tourists.
Yeah. And obviously you found there this, as the tourist yourself, you found the solution, as you say, to just slightly sideways, and you're finding a place that's not over-touristed even in Venice, which is a particularly extreme example. But you do say there are some places that are managing their tourism well. For you, that's not Bhutan. You say that they've got one thing right, but in the round, there's so much wrong. Where do you think overall is doing really well? If you're thinking of like a country or a region or a city that you think has just got it, or?
No, I really can't. I mean, Bhutan is an example of a place that's handling it very well in the way they handle it by making it a place for luxury, expensive tourists. I think an awful lot of countries you can look at, they really need more government control. Because I mean, I think in a lot of ways it comes down to the government in the end, that you cannot leave things totally up to capitalism and free enterprise. And, it does wonderful things, but it does, if you just let it run amok, it will run amok. And I've been to too many countries where they've just allowed anybody to build anything anywhere. And, you think, no, you should have said no. You should have put some restrictions on it. You should have, if the government's getting money in from all these tourists coming, then they should use some of that money in a sensible fashion. And regrettably, I've seen too many countries where they have not done that at all. They've just let anybody build anything anywhere. And I would campaign for a little more control, whether it's government control or, tourism authority control or whatever, but looking at things with a little more respect and putting the money back in, because too often the money that comes in one place doesn't get spent looking after that place. It goes back to the capital city and gets spent by the politicians there. I've seen far too much of that.
Right. Okay. Thanks, Tony. Just some other questions that have come in to bring you. So it's moving away into a different area. One that's being voted up quite a bit is, what do you think about people's approach to perceptions of travel insurance? And do you indeed the whole idea of travel insurance post-pandemic compared to before?
Traveling, I think pandemic travel insurance is really difficult. I am a great believer in travel insurance, and not for when you get your camera stolen or when you overtake, you spend too long on this or do something else badly. Travel insurance, to my mind, is something for disasters. When something goes really seriously wrong, you were in that terrible bus accident or taxi accident, and you need to be flown home or you're not going to survive. That's when travel insurance is necessary. As I say, I'm a great believer in travel insurance, and I've made the odd little claim, and I've never had a really serious disaster. But I do know people who've had serious disasters. And the one I think of in particular, a woman I knew who was a Lonely Planet writer, and she was on a Lonely Planet assignment when the taxi she was in had a head-on collision. The driver was killed. She was lucky to survive. And she was equally lucky to have really good travel insurance, who did absolutely all the right things and, got her back to her home country and got her into hospital and so on. And if she hadn't had that travel insurance, well, at Lonely Planet, we would have stepped forward and done something, but we didn't need to because the travel insurance company did. But I'm a great believer in travel insurance. Don't go anywhere without travel insurance, but not for having your camera stolen. If your camera's stolen, you can always buy another camera. But no, for the serious.
Yeah. You raised there, as you say, the Lonely Planet writer, and it just brought me to, and this idea of these sort of add-on industries, the insurance industry, but also clearly travel guides. And one of our alumni, Paul, a comparative American studies student in 2008, now a travel writer, has talked about the possible demise of almost that profession, and certainly in terms of travel guides, and has referred to the rough guide publisher cutting freelancer payments by 50% and really struggling through this. Lonely Planet, you thankfully sold in 2011. It's no doubt having a difficult time just now. Have you a sense of the future for that as the travel
I don't
industry?
know. I left Lonely Planet some years ago, so what I'm hearing is really secondhand. I don't know but it's very difficult times for travel publishers, because it's like, it's difficult being an airline if people aren't getting on the aircraft. It's difficult being a travel publisher if people aren't buying travel guides. And for the travel writer's perspective, what do you do? How do you know if that hotel is going to be in business next year? It's pointless going to a place and writing up all these hotels if half of the hotels are going to be out of business, or you don't know which restaurants are going to survive or not. So it's very difficult. But of course, travel writing was going through enormous changes anyway. That so much more digital stuff was. I'm fascinated. I mean, I'm not involved in the digital side and so on, but I'm fascinated by the influencers, the Instagrammers, that side of the travel media business, which is not what I grew up with. I grew up, in the print era and the travel writing era, and now it's the Instagram era and the photographs. I went to a conference in Boston just over a year and a half, 2 years ago, and it was full of influencers. And I said, I went along to one thing where there were 3 of the world's best influencers, 1 male, 2 female. And the female side seemed to be you needed to carry a large suitcase around for all the bikinis you needed, because you needed a different color bikini for every beach you appeared on. And I thought, well, that's an element of the travel publishing or travel media business which didn't exist when I grew up with it. And there you go.
The whole visual component.
Yeah, the visual component.
So we're just coming toward the end of our time, and this is perhaps to close, to move back again to the more personal. Quite a few of our alumni writing in were saying, as people can't travel and are thinking of what travel they might want to do, are perhaps becoming more intentional and almost taking their interior journeys and thinking of that in terms of their future travel plans. And you've mentioned a couple of times, you've mentioned an interest in the Santiago de Compostela walk, another walk from Ravenna. Have you thoughts of that sort of more intentional and interior journey, and how that will express itself through travel, whether it be in your own life or generally going forward?
I wish I could, I've had all these months, I should have had loads of time to read all sorts of books, and I've really not read as many travel. I'm reading two at the moment. One is a wonderful account of, I think it was called At Home in the Himalayas, about walking across Pakistan and India, the Himalayas. Jono Lineen, a guy who now lives in Australia, but was born in Belfast and grew up in Canada, and is a very serious walker, and wrote this wonderful book about this 4-month, 2,700 kilometer trek across the Himalaya. So I was reading that book because there is, I think actually we recorded it, and it may be on today, a Ladakhi literature conference, and we discussed his book on this. So I was, vicariously living his Himalayan trek. And I've just today started reading a book about railway travel in Australia, because I'm going to write some blurb line for the book. And I'm one of the last trips I did before everything shut down, late last year, I did a new train trip in Australia, a trip from Adelaide, sort of almost to Sydney and almost to Melbourne, but not quite, and ending up in Brisbane. It was a wonderful train trip. And they were just about to launch this train trip. And of course, then the virus turned up and it was shut down. But yeah, I've been, the other vicarious travel for me these last few months is I've been going through my collection of color slides, back from the days when you used to take color slides, and now it's all digital. And I've been going through thousands of slides and throwing lots of them out and digitizing other ones. So I've been reliving a lot of my travel, but 10, 20, 30 years later, by looking at these old pictures. It's been very interesting.
That's another form of interior travel, isn't it? Yeah. So,
yes, it is, very much so.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Tony. Thank you hugely for your time, personally on behalf of the university and indeed our alumni, and indeed for taking the call so late at night at your end, making it quite civilized for us at this side of the world. So
no, it's been just fine for me. It hasn't been 2 a.m, which is when things are uncivilized. This is still, it's pre-midnight. It's a very reasonable hour. I've enjoyed it. I really have enjoyed talking about it.
Lovely. Thank you, Tony. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. So that's our seminar for today. Obviously, all of those of you who joined today or registered will have a link sent to you with a link to the recording of this this talk. You may be seeing a slide up too that's also showing you the Institute for Global Pandemic Planning. And if you want to link through to that, this again will be sent out with the links to let you look at the university's plans for trying to contribute to how we can do these things better in the future, as it were. Our next alumni webinar will be Thursday, the 21st of January at 12:30. And that's going to have Professor Stuart Croft, the Vice Chancellor of the University, speaking with another Warwick alumnus, Johnny Waits, the Director of Waits Construction, alongside Professor Elizabeth Wellington from our Environmental Systems Interdisciplinary Centre. And that will be advertised in all the usual places on the alumni website, but also in our Facebook and LinkedIn channels. And do clearly keep an eye out for any other alumni emails, given that if you're signed up for those. So thanks again for joining us today. We do hope you'll keep in touch with our future alumni network events. Bye for now.